All right, our next panel is going to try to bring some rationality and some understanding between efficiency measures and the formulas that are used to distribute the majority of the money of school aid that flows to the districts in New Jersey. As you know, the state has a new formula in this current year for distributing money. And as you know, as we sit here today, the New Jersey Supreme Court is reviewing the constitutionality of this formula, just as it has done for numerous other formulas over the past 35 years. But today we're going to not consider what the court is doing per se, but we are going to consider efficiency again, as it relates to formula. For example, is there a nexus between the school formula and efficiency? Can a good formula lead to improved efficiencies? Should a school formula methodology incorporate benchmarks of operational efficiency? Can efficiency as a concept be distilled somehow within the formula? We have three experts here today who have spent a lot of time in education. All of them, I think, yes, all of them have served in the New Jersey Department of Education. One was a commissioner. All are now academics who daily think about the issues of educational policy. Some have deep expertise in developing formulas. Others do research in the issue. All are teachers, and all are, I think, quite expert in this area. So I assume we have the answers to the questions here. You have the bios of everybody in front of you, so I'm not going to go into any detail. And we're going to start out with Tom Corcoran. Tom is presently the co-director of the Consortium in Education at the Teachers College of Columbia. He knows a lot about formula development. He knows a lot about policy, both in New Jersey and, as I've learned recently, around the world. So Tom, please.
Thank you. Good morning. This is actually like a special meeting convened of reform bureaucrats. You know, we meet once a month and say, I shall not regulate. Anyway, but we've been asked to address a rather complex topic, and we only have a few minutes to unpack it. And I warn you, since I've reached that age where I no longer do what I've been told to do very often. So I want to use my few minutes to try to give you some food for thought and discussion by commenting kind of briefly on really three questions. The first one is, really, are we asking the wrong question? Should we actually be talking about efficiency at all? The second is, what might efficiency mean in an era of standards-based education? How should we be thinking about that? And the third one is the question I was asked to talk about, which is, can school formulas actually promote efficiency in the sense of promoting higher attainment of standards? So, I'm just going to comment briefly about each of these questions. You know, you could spend the day on, but I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to try to provoke some conversation. So the first question is, which is, are we asking the wrong question? Let me begin with a cautionary tale. And some of you, a few people in the room here are better educational historians than I, and so they could probably summarize this story better than I. But in the early 20th century, there was a great focus on making the education system more efficient. It was stimulated in part by the need to educate large numbers of immigrants and deal with the rapid expansion of the public schools. It was in part stimulated by the need to train workers for expanding industries and to connect education more closely to the job requirements of these expanding industries. And thirdly, quite differently, it was also motivated in part by the effort to deal with political corruption in our large cities. But in any case, there was a great deal of concern about efficiency, and the results of this are well documented. There's books that most of you are probably familiar with about about the cult of efficiency that dominated in the early part of the 20th century. And the results of that work are still with us to some extent. Ability grouping, tracking based on perceived interest and skills, large, impersonal, comprehensive high schools, like the ones that we have in New York City that I commented on earlier, and the inevitable consequences of these policies, or what seem to be the inevitable consequences, which were racial and class discrimination. I'll skip over the neo-Marxism mumbo-jumbo of some of my professional university colleagues who interpret this, but simply note that in the early first half of the 20th century, progressivism, which focused on human development, on trying to improve teaching and learning, lost out to efficiency concerns in the 1930s and 40s, and we created an education system which has turned out to do a pretty good job, a pretty efficient job of reproducing the class structure that we have in the country. We've gone from a country with the highest rates of social mobility in the Western world to the country that has the lowest rates of social mobility in the Western world, and a country that had that was closing income gaps to a country that has the largest income gaps among developed countries. The education system's not totally to blame for all that, but it contributed to it. The moral I take away from that cautionary tale is that efficiency has to be linked, if we're going to have discussions about efficiency, they've got to be linked to a very clear understanding of what our educational goals are, what kind of outcomes we are seeking, what the distribution of outcomes is that we're seeking. This raises a second, maybe serious problem, which concerns the measures that we use. Education indicators such as test scores you can think of as intermediate products in the sense that they're indicators of progress toward the larger ends of having a productive society, a civil society that in which we want to live, a high quality of life. Efficiency is concerned with the relationship between the resource inputs, the cost in terms of labor, capital, equipment, and either the intermediate outputs, the test scores, the credits earned, and so on, or ultimate education outcomes, the success in college, degrees earned, jobs obtained, life satisfaction, and so on. Now, many researchers use intermediate outputs as measures of effectiveness, and most of the studies that have been done looking at productivity in education or looking at the production function have used these kind of intermediate measures, the test scores, state test scores, or standardized test scores. And in my judgment, this leads to some very biased conclusions. In fact, sometimes I think conclusions are just totally wrong. And one reason for that is that the test scores don't reflect our actual goals for education. They certainly don't reflect the goals that most of us in this room hold for our own children. They don't cover all the standards that we set. Even if we all agree that the standards reflect an adequate definition of those goals, the tests, in fact, don't cover all the standards. I've been doing some work in Texas lately, and there's a woman that runs around Texas doing workshops who can go unnamed, but people pay large amounts of money, $1,000 a day, to come to these workshops, and basically what she tells them is which parts of the standards are not covered in the state test, so that you can eliminate those. Why don't have to teach those? You can just teach the things that are on the state test, which turns out to be only like 55% of the standards. So, why bother to spend any time teaching the rest? And a related problem is that these commonly used measures, the state test and other standardized tests, have ceiling effects, dramatic ceiling effects. A lot of districts in New Jersey where 99 or 100% of the kids pass the state test, where a lot of kids get perfect scores on the state test. And in fact, these ceiling effects, they don't reveal the full range of outcomes, and they don't really tell us about the size of the learning gaps that exist between different populations. So we read in the paper that we're closing the gaps on these standardized test scores, and we feel smugly confident that something good is happening, when in fact the actual gaps may be increasing or maybe are much greater than what these tests reveal. So much of the work has been done to examine efficiency or discuss production functions, I think is badly distorted because the kind of outcome measures that people are using are weak and don't in fact really match up with our goals or our aspirations for our children. In fact, we may not be very clear as a society what we mean by effectiveness, let alone how to measure it. And so I would argue that maybe effectiveness ought to be our focus. Maybe we ought to really be talking about what it means to have an effective system. And if we could determine that, then it wouldn't be so hard to figure out what it costs to provide that for different populations, for different groups to give that opportunity to different groups of children. So let me turn to the second question. How do we think about efficiency in an era of standards? If our goal is to help all or almost all children attain proficiency, which is the goal of a standard-based system, and if we could put aside the measurement problems for a moment and the definition problems and assume we actually knew what proficiency meant, and we agreed by some miracle what proficiency meant. Since I get to be the speaker, I get to make these great assumptions, so, right. Then we might say an efficient system is one that produces the highest percentage of proficient graduates at the least cost. But of course, the systems deal with children with quite varying needs. And so systems that are efficient at meeting the needs of one population might actually look quite different than systems that are meeting the needs of other populations. The assumption, in fact, that all these systems should look alike is an assumption that comes out of the status quo. And if we only think about efficiency in terms of what works in terms of the way schools are currently organized and structured, we actually may be ruling out the possibilities that might work best for different parts of the population. Beyond just trying to figure out how to define efficiency and how to measure it, another issue really in a standards-based system is how do we provide instruction that's actually going to help students reach proficiency. If we want better performance, then we want higher quality teaching. And we can think about efficiency really in two different ways here when we start thinking about instruction. The first way would be to think about how can we focus instruction to make it more efficient? How do we get rid of the kind of fragmented, idiosyncratic, disconnected ways that instruction is delivered to children? If you talk to kids about their experience in school, it's like this kind of series of disconnected events that they experience during the course of the day. So how can we make instruction more efficient? This, of course, is what our predecessors tried to do in the early 20th century with tracking, ability grouping, ability testing. But we're smarter, and we know more than they did about learning. And we know that to make instruction more efficient, we need to develop learning progressions that are really ways of taking what we learned out of cognitive science and research on teaching and laying out a sequence of activities that are going to be an optimal experience for kids to understand and master certain concepts and skills. We know that we need highly specified evidence-based regimes to guide teaching, akin to practice guidelines in medicine. We know we need better assessments that actually capture the outcomes that we care about, and not just factual knowledge in science or procedural knowledge in mathematics. Now, the encouraging news is that work is underway on these kind of systems and on these kind of tools, but in fact we need major research and development investments to design and test them, and even harder, and I think this is what Paul was alluding to earlier, harder than getting the R&D investments is getting the political will to require their use so that we actually begin to have a system that delivers efficient instruction to all children. The second way to think about efficiency in this context of standard-based reform would be to ask, how can we get districts, if instruction is the key thing here, it's like, it's the economy, stupid, well, it's instruction. It isn't the school buses. They're important, but it's not the school buses. It's not the swimming pools. It's not the soccer teams. It really is instruction. It's the heart of the business of schools. And how do we get districts organized efficiently so that more of their resources are spent on instruction? We assume that students are in school to learn, that instruction is the portion of the budget that is closely linked to learning. But in fact, in the United States, we spend less of each education dollar on instruction than any developed country, significantly less. We have school districts in New Jersey that spend less than half of their money on instruction. And we have other districts that spend 75 or 80% on instruction. And over the last 20 years of reform, the proportion of money that's been spent on instruction has changed very little, in spite of our efforts at reform. So how could we, in fact, improve, how could we change that? How could we make systems, in a sense, more efficient by getting them to spend more of their money on the core business that they're involved in and less of their money on many other things? It seems to me that's an important question to think about. How could we alter that pattern of expenditure? So finally, I get to the third question, which was the question I was asked to talk about. This was all preamble, right? But I'd like to think important preamble. How can we use formulas to promote efficiency? Well, you know, school formulas are very messy policies. Policy, you know, it's like making sausage. You know, no one likes to really talk about how policies get made. But the policy issues that are embedded or nested within a school formula really involve a mutually incompatible set of values or goods. And this is why it's sort of hard to think about, you know, about school formulas as, you know, being perfect in some way. Because, in fact, you're trying to create equal educational opportunity for children. You're trying to create an equitable distribution of the tax burden. You're trying to preserve local control of education. And you're trying to, in fact, be engaged in responsible management of the state budget. And you're trying to, in fact, find a solution in a formula that maximizes all these goods, that is, getting as much of each one as we can, but, in fact, trying to get more of one of them inhibits the others. They're incompatible, basically incompatible objectives, and you're trying to come up with some way of balancing those incompatible interests or goals. And reasonable people, like Paul and I, can disagree about what the right balance is, about what's the right balance between equal opportunity for children, equitable distribution of the tax burden, preserving local control and community involvement, and responsibly managing the state's obligations. Maximizing, you cannot maximize all of those. You make choices and you try to create balance. Now, it's tempting when you're working on formulas, it's tempting to think about how can you use them to leverage districts to be more efficient. How can you know, what are the levers you can twist and turn to, in fact, get more of the outcomes that you care about? And there are some ways that is done. First, we target funds. So we earmark certain funds for remediation, technology, security, whatever, gifted education. It's a long list. We all have our favorite set of earmarks. My list would be different than your list, and we argue over these targeted funds. And these efforts work in one sense, that is, in the sense that the money that we target for gifted education gets spent more or less. We actually don't know, but we think more or less on gifted children. And the education that goes to technology gets spent more or less on technology. Ironically, however, these earmarked funds also contribute to the growth of local bureaucracies, which other people see as evidence of inefficiency. So the more we try to target, the larger these central offices grow, and the more fragmented and the harder it is to do the job that the superintendent was talking about earlier of trying to integrate all these pieces locally. A second way that formulas get used to try to promote efficiency is by setting caps on certain classes of expenditures. So we can say you can only spend 6% on district administration. You can only spend X percent on school administration, and so on. And some formulas have tried to do that, and I'm guilty of mucking around with caps at an earlier time in my career. I was younger, and my excuse is I didn't know better. But the first type of caps, that is the caps on certain classes of expenditures, they seem to lead more to redefinitions and deceptions than they do to efficiencies. They just get school districts, you know, now we label this person as an instructional supervisor. They used to be a building administrator, and now we label this person as a professional development coach. That's for instruction. So we just change the names and the labels, and the reporting categories are pretty broad and crude, and so we actually, you know, the caps don't seem to work all that very well. We can also put caps on increases in overall expenditures, which we've done in New Jersey. And it's not clear that that type worked very well either to promote efficiencies. We actually, we face right now in New Jersey a kind of natural experiment where some of us ought to be doing some analysis and work. We're going to have a reduction, if not a growth, if not in actuality, of state aid, and local budgets will slow, and we can watch what happens when that goes on, and watch how do districts manage this? What do they cut? How do they protect outcomes in that process? My guess is expenditures will slow, if not flatten, and outcomes won't change much at all. They might even continue to go up. And what does that tell us? It's something to think about. So, a third way that formulas get used to think a little bit to try to promote efficiency is something that was mentioned earlier, but in a negative sense. Requiring local effort in a formula is actually believed to ensure that local publics will exercise some oversight over the expenditure of money. If it's their money, they're going to watch it more than if it's state money. That's sort of the theory of having the local share be part of the formula. And it seems to work to some degree. I mean, if you compare places like Hawaii, where the state pays everything in terms of level of interest in school budgets and what goes on, to what goes on in New Jersey, you have to say at least we have evidence here that there's more interest. There's not by the voting patterns, but at least by the local disputes that arise. But there may be some tipping point here where local effort local effort's so low and state aid is so large that this idea about local effort encouraging local oversight, in fact, simply doesn't work. So my conclusion from trying to think a little bit about how we use formulas as mechanisms to promote efficiency is that formulas are really pretty crude mechanisms, and they're designed to maximize multiple goals, which are incompatible, and efficiency is another such goal, and they simply don't do a very good job of doing that. That if we want efficiency, I think we have to think about go back to what I had said earlier, which is to think hard about what outcomes do we care about, how good are our measures, and how do we then focus instruction on achieving those outcomes, and how do we set up a system both at the state level and local level that is focused in promoting those kind of learning attainments. Thank you very much.
And next we have David Hespe, who is an associate professor in educational leadership at Rowan University, and someone who has also mucked around in formulas, and a former commissioner of the Department of Education. David? Yeah, you muck around here. I can't find you. Is this it?
Right there. Right there.
Maybe I'll get rid of it.
Yeah, I'll do it. Right there, right.
This is
Yeah. Full screen?
Yeah.
Slideshow, right?
Yeah, slideshow.
No, that's not what we wanted. We wanted this one. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Sorry about the little technical difficulties there, but like most professors, when I want to say too much in too short a period of time, I like to use a PowerPoint just to show I'm trying. So I'm going to try to do that. One thing, also the PowerPoint I think is going to work well because I do want to spend at least a few minutes on the history of formulas in New Jersey. I promised I would do that, although I'm looking around the room and I think most of you probably have been there and done that with me over the last 20 years. Matter of fact, I think I'm seeing some faces and remembering people sleeping on tables the night QEA was passed, and here's one right there. If you remember that night in the long morning, or early morning at least, when the QEA was there. But what I would like to do first is the question that was posed was, can funding formulas really affect local budgeting decisions and operational efficiency? And I think hypothetically the answer to that is yes. The more important question for my presentation is, can we do that in New Jersey? And I think the answer to that is probably with great difficulty. Why? Well, if you look back over the history of the funding formulas, I'm going to try to focus in on this issue. We have formulas. We've had 4 of them in what I would call the modern era since the income tax was passed. And it's great to have a formula. They look great in the statute books, but they never run. And I would challenge that you really can't use a funding formula to promote efficiency if they don't in fact run. It's very difficult to have administrators rely on them, predictability, money goes in places that is not intended. And my comments, at least initially, are going to focus on why is that? Why is it that we can't put a funding formula together that runs 1 year or 2 years? SFRA, if it runs this year, could set a world record in New Jersey for a second year of running. And I want to look at that. And why is that? And can we reverse that trend and actually put together a meaningful formula that we fund, that we're committed to, that educators, more importantly, and taxpayers can rely on? And I'd like to focus in on that. And then I'm going to move from there. And if a formula runs, what components can best promote operational efficiency, and then look at alternatives. I think a couple of presenters have indicated that currently the rules of the game might be structured in a way that funding formulas really can't promote efficiency in New Jersey, and some ideas of what an alternative system might look like. Before I begin, however, I also want to just mention a note in expanding on Tom's thought that funding formulas are very difficult things. They're very difficult to develop. They're very difficult to provide a theoretical base for. They're very difficult to go and promote and get buy-in by all the stakeholders in the educational community. They're tough to get past the legislature, and they're tough to fund. If the treasurer is out there, I know we have a couple people from that office around, they're tough to fund. And then once you've accomplished all those things, you still have to go to the Supreme Court and say, this we think answers the question we've been trying to answer in this state since 1973, and that's how do we provide a thorough and efficient education for all our children. And if you go through all those steps, and we haven't, I don't think we've ever gone to step 6. We've gotten close, maybe, but we've never gotten to the end. And so these are very difficult things, and even though I'll look at 4 formulas, I think you have to look at them in that context. A lot of time and effort goes into them, and once you go through the process, you really swear it off. You're never going to do it again. And I think a lot of us at this panel have sworn off funding formulas because you just never want to go through that process. It's like spending thousands of hours making the most beautiful porcelain vase, and then someone coming in and looking at it and said, this is junk, and throwing it on the floor, and you look at it, stunned belief, disbelief, and then you move on. So I'm going to, which I'm going to do now. I'm going to move on to a short history of funding formulas. And a couple of themes that I would like to focus on. Again, answering the question, why don't these things last? Why aren't these things predictable? Number one, I think every modern formula since 1975 has been developed in response to equity litigation. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does provide complexity. It does add layers of problems that one must work through, and the context often in terms of the rhetoric that goes back and forth often is unhealthy if your goals really are educational. The second issue looks back to the income tax. What's the income tax for? Well, if you go to the Constitution, and Paul, I think, spent a lot of time on a thorough and efficient clause, but if you go to the Constitution and look at the local income tax, what's the local income tax for? Is that to defray the cost of education? No. It's to reduce local property taxes, which immediately says, well, our system has to have some underpinning in local operational control of our schools. And this is important because when legislatures and treasury officials and governors look at and say, all right, is the funding formula more of a educational formula or is it more of a political formula? Oftentimes the decision is, well, it's more of a political formula. Local districts are responsible for education. Our formula just distributes dollars. And the third issue is, as I look quickly through here, of the last 4 funding formulas, is they've all been foundation-type formulas. There's been substantive changes, but the mechanism is still QEA. CFA was QEA-based. SFRA is QEA-based. We really haven't moved too far off the QEA mechanism. I'm not going to make a decision or even have an opinion whether that's good or bad, because I think I've been involved in at least 2 of those first three, not the last one. And I do like foundation formulas, but I need, in terms of, I don't have answers, I want to provide insights. Is that an issue to this phenomena of our formulas not running? Okay, quick history lesson, but I know everyone in this room knows this, so I'm going to move very quickly through. First formula, Chapter 212, guaranteed tax base. Formula certainly had its proponents. Ernie certainly is a major proponent, and every time I talk to Ernie, I say, okay, I think you're right. I move on to QEA and others. Importantly, this was where the income tax came in, and the income tax dedication, more importantly. Next period of time I want to look at is 90 to 94. Here's where the first foundation formula came in with the QEA. QEA was developed before Abbott v. Burke was actually issued, but certainly the anticipation of all was that Chapter 212 was not going to be ruled constitutional, and certainly was not. QEA in turn was changed before I think it was ever fully implemented. It was changed. That modified QEA was also ruled to be unconstitutional, which brings us to the 90s, and I don't want anyone to think that the periods of time between these years were peaceful ones in terms of litigation. They were not. There's tremendous amounts of litigation going on. CFA was passed in this period of time. Again, another foundation formula. And here we have the Supreme Court immediately ruling that ruling CFA was not constitutional. Parity funding was ordered, as well as supplemental programs, which we now fast track forward to 2008. And if the period between the end of QEA and CFA was an active period of litigation, certainly the period between CFA and SFRA was even more active in terms of litigation. SFRA approached another foundation formula, but approached the funding of disadvantaged children differently than prior formulas in terms of allowing the dollars to follow the student. In my mind, here's part of the problem. I just want to make sure it's up there. Okay. Every now and then I always do that with my students, just to make sure I'm really up there. Part of the problem, and a number of presenters have alluded to this, is the fact that we often think of our funding formulas as the keystone of our educational funding system, that it kind of combines everything and glues everything together. Of course, that's not what in reality happens with our funding formula. There are so many other pieces of the system that are out there in terms of local budgetary decisions and approval, local district collective bargaining agreements, monitoring, accountability, CUSAC, NCLB, CAPA, whatever you want to look at. Funding formula is not the piece of legislation that holds all the other pieces together. Matter of fact, I find it hard to refer to our educational system as a system, and I think Paul referred to that earlier. There is no, I think, interworking of these mechanisms, and matter of fact, the opposite seems to be true more often. They're in conflict. And if the funding formula is supposed to be that keystone, it's certainly not working in that way. Again, and Tom mentioned this, and so I'm going to work through this very quickly, is we also approach the formula from many different directions. We want it to be so many different things only because that's the environment in which it's being produced. Back to how difficult these things are to put into place. It needs to address equity litigation, needs to distribute those income tax dollars, and note the word fairly. Has to be perceived to be fair, or it's never going to pass through the legislative process, nevertheless judicial process. We also want to use it to support educational programs, SFRA added security aid, early childhood aid. We want to reduce the impact on state budget. Certainly that was a big issue for those on the Appropriations Committee or in the Treasury Department. The state aid formula is the 800-pound gorilla in the state budget. And oftentimes the issue was, can we even afford this formula to run in this year? We also wanted to reduce local property taxes, and whether that we want districts to use some of their state aid dollars for tax relief, we want them to appropriate surpluses for their tax relief, or we actually want them to reduce spending. We also have that goal in the formula as well. We want to promote efficiency, and we have efficiency. I don't want to say transportation again because we won't want to go through that busing issue, but transportation efficiency I thought was a workable efficiency standard in CFA. I thought that was a workable standard to try to get districts focused on transportation. Special education tiering was another example. And finally, multiple goals. Formulas are used to send political messages, administrative penalties, for example, and certainly local budget vote. But here's, I think, where formulas hit the road, and that is we underfund them, we don't fund them, we discontinue them. We always have the Annual Appropriations Act. And every year, the legislature is going to pass that Annual Appropriations Act, and the footnote language in that act has grown considerably in terms of directing the movement of money around local districts and local municipalities, and it's understandable. Why does that happen? Fluctuations in our revenue base, and I think we're going to be seeing that again the coming year. State spending priorities move either because ordered by the court or because of some other initiatives, and certainly the school equity lawsuits. So we have a system, but the funding formulas never seem to be able to run, and when they don't run, we make the situation worse, because normally in the annual budget, we're freezing people, and when you freeze school districts don't stay the same. They're not static. You have a constant growth in enrollment or a decline in enrollment. You have a growth in wealth or a decrease in wealth. And what you do when you freeze aid, especially when you freeze aid over long periods of time, is you wind up diverting dollars to places you don't want it to go. If you want to promote efficiency, if that's your goal, operational efficiency, you're now sending it places where you don't want it to go. And when you finally fully fund, normally next time you come up with a funding formula, you're going to fully fund it at least 1 year. When you do that, you find that you have all these anomalies. How do you take care of anomalies? Well, you freeze their aid. You say they can only get 5% increases or 10% increases, and you start confounding the problem even more. And now is the second issue. I said I'd finally get to it. I know I'm probably running out of time. Okay. Last, thanks, Rich. I always get that look. Well, thanks, Tom. But see, I haven't gotten to that point in my career. I still got to ask. Even if it did run, would it work? And number one, large number of districts don't receive any regular education aid anyway. A third probably receive little or none. How are you going to influence their decision making? The formula and spending practices. The formula is not an accurate depiction of what's happening in local districts. We still don't have an enrollment count that accurately portrays how many students are actually showing up in schools. We use grandfather clauses constantly in terms of every new funding formula. We grandfather people in, and this presents its own problems. So even if the formula did run, I think the ones we've been building over the last 15, 20 years, I don't think are going to be there. I'm just going to roll through this one. I think you can get there. And I want to go to moving forward. What's the best way to promote efficiency? Spending levy caps have worked in the state in the past. I do believe the S-1701 has impacted district spending, but you have to keep the exceptions down. What I would propose are non-dollar incentives. This has been talked about quite a bit. If we can come up with a definition of efficiency, why not say to school districts, you will be able to do certain things? I just came up with one, and 100 pop into my mind. The need to retire school buses on some given time period, 15 years. Not voting on school district budgets, and I hope that legislation passes, because I think it'd be very desirable. But here's where I think you get your biggest bang for the buck, if we can look at non-dollar incentives, because we know those will always be there. Free from regulations that efficient districts should be freed from. I think the discussions regarding the executive county superintendents are excellent ones, but again, you need the capacity and the expertise, and it's a wonderful law. I think it will do great things, but only if the capacity and the expertise is there to carry it forward. Regionalization, I won't repeat what the last panel said. Diversity in school providers. I do think that we've had success with early childhood providers, with charter schools, with our inter-district public school choice program. New Jersey's always had choice. And if you think back to even when the county vocational schools began their academies, everyone remember the superintendents remember that? The first inclination was, let's sue to stop that. County vocational schools couldn't have academies, they're siphoning all our children. And then districts stopped that. Once we said no enough, they stopped that. And they started looking and said, what can we do to keep these kids? How can we improve our programs to keep our kids? And I do think that choice requires that introspection, or at least I would hope choice requires that level of introspection. Moving forward, if we're not satisfied that those things I just mentioned are going to work, my last point, and then I'm done, Rich, is that we might need to totally reassess how we fund our schools. And this has been a point at least a couple of our presenters have discussed. Unify our funding. You then have all the districts with a vested interest in responding to what you have in the formula. And number two, you'll also establish some workable spending controls. That's a long way to get to that point, but I did want to end my presentation. If we're not happy where we are, this is the next step. Thank you.
Sounds like you feel passionate about this subject.
It's a good topic.
Our final batter for this morning here is Gordon MacInnes. Gordon is on the faculty here at the Woodrow Wilson School. He's a former assistant commissioner at the Department of Education. And perhaps more importantly, to give a little extra balance to the panel, he's a former New Jersey legislator. So he brings a lot of different perspectives to this issue. And Gordon has about 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll throw it open to the audience, because I think we probably have a lot of interesting points here.
Yeah, let's get that down. Thank you. Good morning. Actually, Rich, I thought you wanted me to go for the full 45 minutes before lunch.
That's why I put you last.
Actually, if were I your friend, I'd say I agree with what David said, I agree with what Tom said, and I would sit down. But I won't. But if you want to feel old, come to one of these things. Dave's PowerPoint went up there, I realized that I had actually voted for Chapter 212 and for the income tax when I was a member of the Assembly, and I voted against CFA and against the reduction in the income tax when I was a member of the Senate. And that was separated by a lot of years. And I think, by the way, in terms of the question that is supposed to motivate us, that Joe Cryan provided the answer. As to whether or not a formula can actually be effective in achieving efficiencies. His answer, if properly understood, was, of course not, because the legislature is not going to deal with the issues of any expenditures that have to do with negotiated contracts. And we know that. And since that covers the vast majority of expenditures, the idea that somehow in Trenton we're going to control for this in a way that will affect materially the operating efficiencies in school districts, I think, is beyond our control. What I'd like to suggest is that we can at least illuminate our conversation about the margins here by looking at our experience with Abbott, because this, in fact, is a funding program that came about through the court decisions that Paul mentioned and that we're all familiar with, and which now influence 60% of the state aid that goes to school districts. That is, 60% of the operating school aid goes to the 31 Abbott districts. So I think we know that a large investment is being made by the taxpayers of this state in a relatively small number of districts who in combination educate not quite now 20% of all the enrolled K-12 students. And I think it teaches us a lot about efficiency. And by that I do incorporate Tom's redefinition of efficiency to include effectiveness. First, I think we can agree that Abbott does provide sufficient resources to the Abbott districts, and in this world and in this year, the idea that we could go much higher, I think, is beyond the realm of political, financial, or moral possibility. So what have we done with these resources since they were mandated by the Supreme Court beginning in 1997 in Abbott 4 with the imposition of parity aid and followed in the following year with supplemental aid? Well, I think we've learned, first of all, that the most important thing is not the level of resources, but how they're used. And that if the resources are well used and if they're focused on improving academic achievement of Abbott students, then I think we could all step back and say that was a worthwhile investment to make. And if they are poorly used, if they are incoherently used, if they are recklessly used, then I think we all have the same reaction, which is this is a crime. This is a tragedy for the children who were supposed to have their life chances improved by a Supreme Court decision. And they have not. And we have a real variety to select from. We can look at the experience in Asbury Park, for example, where in the last actual expenditure that was reported on the website of the New Jersey Department of Education, Asbury Park spent more than $25,000 a kid. And for that, not quite half of the fourth graders in Asbury Park are proficient on the language arts exam given in 2008. Now, I would think, and there are a lot of factors, as Tom characterized, there are a lot of factors that go into that, and we shouldn't rely so heavily on a single measure taken on a single day of fourth graders in Asbury Park. But here's what we do know. The trend line is discouraging. The trend line is discouraging. After a couple of years of focused effort on trying to improve literacy, Asbury Park has fallen off noticeably every year. And there's a reason for that, because it's not money. It's because I think there is a lack of will and attention to the instructional needs of the students who attend the Asbury Park public schools by the people who run the Asbury Park public schools. Now, this can be compared with the experience of students who attend schools in Union City. Union City spends half of what Asbury Park spends per student. And in the last reported actuals, it was about $12,500. And for that, just about three-quarters, a little more than three-quarters of all the fourth graders are judged proficient on the latest New Jersey ask. Now, beyond that, what Union City has demonstrated, because we've had a lot of good starts with young children in New Jersey and across the nation. What's peculiar to Union City and to a couple of other Abbott districts is the fact that those gains, that instruction in literacy has succeeded in being carried forward through the middle grades. So taking one of the tougher New Jersey assessments, last year, Union City 8th graders performed at the state average on the mathematics test. 8th graders. Now that has not happened elsewhere, and we ought to learn from that. And what is the quick lesson? Well, not surprisingly, because we've known this for a long time, Union City focuses on academic achievement. And they particularly focus on making certain that young children are strong readers, because if they're not, they can't be educated. And the experience that we all know about is that kids who struggle with reading in the 5th or 7th or 9th grade, in most places have practically no chance of ever learning to read at grade level. And what we're doing now is to increase the rigor and the amount of content that they're going to be responsible for in those grades by having tougher academic standards, and the thought that we're going to simultaneously raise their reading levels so that they can address this increasingly rigorous content is delusional, isn't it? It just can't happen. Now, I could go through some other examples, but Rich Keevy said I couldn't do all the things I wanted to do. I will point out that there are other larger districts, because taking smaller districts, and Asbury Park is a small district and Union City is a middle-sized district, that's unfair. It might be fair to look at the difference between Elizabeth and Newark. Newark is the third highest Abbott spending district, $17,000 a kid. Elizabeth's in the middle range, around 15. And in Elizabeth, we've seen a steady trajectory upwards in early literacy, as measured by the 3rd and 4th grade language arts tests, to the point where now, in the most recent test, 80% of their 3rd graders were proficient on the third grade test. I think that's deserving of a wow. That's a really essential thing for 9-year-old kids to be able to read at least well enough to pass the language arts test, and it's not good enough. It's not good enough because that means that a fifth of the kids still are not proficient, but it represents tremendous progress from where Elizabeth started 10 years ago, and there are reasons for that. We won't go into them because of me and Rich Keevy. And the experience in Newark is frankly a more stagnant experience in terms of the trajectory of student proficiency on the state assessments. Now, let me just offer, since Assemblyman Crine has indicated we're not going to be able to do this through a formula in major scale, let me suggest that there are some indicators that should not be carved in granite into any formula, except those that we can all agree on. Here's what we can agree on. We can agree that tax funds should not pay for 6-pound lobster dinners for superintendents in Philadelphia restaurants. We can agree that tax funds should not pay to send the Board of Education to Hawaii to a conference on recent developments in audiovisual technology. We can agree that tax funds should not be used for $600,000 severance packages for retiring superintendents. But beyond those things, it's really difficult to find sufficient agreement and potency for us to incorporate efficiency standards into a formula or even into, frankly, regulation. But let me suggest some indicators where people might look. They cannot conclude by looking at these indicators what is going on in those districts, but it might establish some flags, some red flags to look for, to see if public funds are being spent efficiently and effectively for instruction. First, look at the percentage of teachers who are certified but not in the classroom. There are districts, and there's quite a range among Abbott districts on this number. And it may be that strong master teachers have been identified and selected to assist others, more struggling teachers, on the daily challenges that they face in one of the hardest jobs in the world, educating concentrations of poor kids in poor districts. That's got to be about the hardest job in the world. And it may be that the approach taken is to identify the best teachers and to get them into the classroom assisting their colleagues. Or it may be that they've selected teachers with seniority who don't want to be in the classroom anymore, and exactly what they're doing outside the classroom is less clear. It's not clear, in fact, in some districts, and I won't name those districts. Secondly, let's look at technology. A vastly overrated ingredient in improved instruction over the last 40 years. Don't you remember educational TV was going to figure this out for us? Sesame Street was going to close the kindergarten gap for poor kids. Computer-assisted instruction has been offered as a way to neutralize teachers. And in New Jersey, our court has ordered that there be a certain number of computers for whatever number of kids are in that school. And the districts have complied. Abbott districts now have a lower ratio of students to computers than does the average district in New Jersey. And after 10 years, I would assume that, first of all, if those computers are valuable to instruction, that they've been maintained and then replaced, because a lot of changes occurred in computer technology during that time, and that we're probably at a point where we may not need technology coordinators in every single Abbott school. And that the value of having a person with that title and a relatively undefined job description may have run its course. It may not have run its course in some places. I just suggest that this is a place to look. Third, each year, districts report their finances. They're audited. The audited results go into the state report that is available on the web. And one of the categories that is employed, I assume by the National Center for Educational Statistics, is contracted services in the classroom, without that being well defined. But if you look at that particular category, you will find a very substantial range that I think needs explanation. Let me give a quick comparison here. In Union City, aforementioned, that number is $43 per student. In Asbury Park, that number is $2,615. In Newark, that number is $1,482. And in Orange, a nearby district that has also witnessed sustained improvement in early literacy, that number is $183. Now, does that reflect an especially effective program in either of those high-spending districts? It might, but it might not. And my guess is it probably doesn't. And in the case of Asbury Park, I'm almost certain it doesn't. But that is something to look at. Fourth, or is this fifth? Fourth, look at turnover rates for first-time teachers. Follow them out for 5 years. This is a major investment by districts. It's going to happen all the time because each year teachers are going to retire, or they're going to quit, or they're going to get a better job in a different district, or they're going to move to Tennessee. So we're always going to be replenishing that supply. There are a lot of them in major districts. How well they are treated and supported and nurtured has a lot to do with how long they stay. And in districts where they stay a short time and leave, that might tell you something about the quality of what's going on in the instruction. It almost inevitably does. By the way, you can do this simply by taking the turnover rates in the annual report cards that each school files. Go to a high-performing school. It could be in Abington Avenue in Newark or Ann Street in Newark. It doesn't have to be in one of the districts that I've mentioned as being performing particularly well. And look at the teacher turnover rates. Go back 5 years, and you'll see a very small number. Now go to an underperforming school in the same district and go back 5 years and look at the teacher turnover rate. It's not conclusive, but it tells you something. Tom mentioned the percentage of funding that goes for instruction. Now, all of this is subject, again, to Tom's caution that the framework for these numbers is drawn up by the National Center for Educational Statistics. And there appears to be opportunity for wide interpretation as to what NCS means when it comes to defining instruction. And I have seen, depending on what regulation or budgetary guidance had been issued in terms of something like administrative expenses, where between June 30th of the previous year and July 1st of the budget year, there was a sudden change of about 20% in administrative expenses. And it turned out that in this one district, new job descriptions were issued on June 30th, so that the job description for every administrator suddenly assumed direct instructional responsibilities. And thereby 20% of the cost of all those administrators suddenly was transferred to instruction. So be careful. But even with that, you'll see that there is again substantial differences. Asbury Park in Newark, 47 and 42% of the budget is for instruction. West New York and Union City, it's 57 and 52%. Noticeable difference. It's not, again, conclusive, but it's a flag to look for. Finally, I would suggest that we look at the treatment of special education students. This is a discouraging topic in a lot of districts, and the measures for whether or not a quality education is as hoped for with an individualized education plan is being realized cannot be, that is not a question that can be answered quickly or easily by looking at the various indicators. But I would suggest that if special education students are segregated in great quantity, that it is highly unlikely that they are receiving a productive instruction. Finally, let me just say, aren't you happy to hear that word?
That was twice.
Was it twice? No, but I have divided my speech into categories, and this is the final point. You want me off? Let me just offer this, and it's been raised before. None of this is really going to be productive in terms of our search to try and find what's working with hard-to-educate kids if we do not have a really high-quality student-level database that covers every kid in every school in the state of New Jersey, including all kids enrolled in preschool programs. We don't have that yet. It's not easy to do. States that are way ahead of us in terms of the investment and in terms of the time they've been at it are still having troubles producing a student-level database that produces regularly reliable information. But it is absolutely essential that we have that information. Otherwise, we are left to an assortment of randomized trials and sampling that will not produce the information that we need on how well we're actually educating the real kids in our system. And with that, I'll sit down. Thank you, Rich.
Well, thank you very much. I think we learned a lot from these three experts. And we have about 15 minutes left for questions. So let's, if Dale can take the microphone over. I see the gentleman on the right. Let's start over there. If you could just wait till we get the mic.
Whether you focus, can you hear? Whether you focus on thorough, efficient, efficiency, proficiency, effectiveness, for me, the bottom line is the teacher-student-parent relationship. Why don't we focus on that?
I guess, Tom, you want to see?
Isn't that one for you, Rich? Isn't that the panelists focus on
The non-panelists? I don't know.
Well, I think I did indicate I think we should focus on making instruction more focused, and for me that is the interaction between teachers and students and the curriculum and parents in support of students. So I would agree that that's where we need to focus. We need to focus on increasing the amount of money that's spent on instruction. We need to focus on making instruction better organized, more focused, more efficient, improve the quality of it. So, I think that is where we need to go, and we can't simply be we can't be content with simply allocating large sums of money that are spent in necessarily in unspecified ways. I think we have to bite the bullet and say that people have to work within a knowledge base and within frameworks that we think are, that at this point are most likely to produce success.
Anybody else want to observe anything?
I'd just say ditto to what Tom said, and I would add to that to say that most policies that are made, whether it's by the Supreme Court or by the legislature or by the Department of Education or the local school board, is made without considering the relationship that you're talking about. In fact, that is the controlling relationship. If we don't improve what happens between teachers and students in classrooms in poor districts, we're never going to get to where we want to be. That should be the starting point for making policy. It is practically never considered. Otherwise, you wouldn't have all of these answers being handed down, mandates being handed down year after year, changing year after year, because we don't know what should be done at the policy level to ensure that every kid gets the break that they need, that they deserve. And that should be the central focus. It rarely is, because it's so difficult when you make it the central focus. And we want to do things that are convenient and easier for the adults.
Can I add a caveat to that?
Sure.
Clearly, learning takes place when you have a motivated teacher and a motivated learner, whether or not that's a parent or a faculty member in a school. And what we're talking about here, I think, needs to be connected quite directly with that. But oftentimes we lose that focus, and coming back to that, I think, is a good idea. But clearly, everything we're talking about here does have to come back to that willing learner, willing teacher in the end.
Can I just?
Yeah, Tom has a
note. I think we also have to bear in mind that we ask teachers to do things or to achieve goals that in fact we do not know how to do, that we do not have the knowledge to guide them, and we need to be sensitive to that. We need to provide them with better guidance and do the kind of work that would provide them with better tools. But we continually ask them to do things and to be accountable for things that in fact we don't know how to achieve.
That's why I think the evaluation system is one of the missing links in terms of the getting to efficiency and effectiveness, particularly in the teacher process, because we need to tie in, again, this is the efficiency concept, we need to tie in compensation to a properly developed, with input from the teachers and their unions and the administration and the parents, an evaluation system, and the students, and the students that measures whether we're achieving success. And that changes over time. That does change over time, and the knowledge base that you said that you learn over time has to be adjusted. But until we actually use an evaluation system that's effective on a statewide basis, that ties into compensation lines, we're not going to get the ultimate efficiency that we need But I'm not saying it's easy. This is the most difficult thing there is to do. But it's the thing that we have to do. We have to come to that connection, and we have to keep working at it.
I couldn't disagree more. And I couldn't disagree more because, first of all, we don't know how to do what you just suggested. Maybe, yeah, but we're not going to do it at the policy-making level in New Jersey. It's going to happen someplace else, and with experiments and lots of experiments to try and parse the contribution of individual teachers to the education of 23 kids over the course of a year, or the education of 150 kids over the course of a year. Not a simple thing to do, and nobody's done it well yet. And in the meantime, what you're doing is sending a signal that the problem of instruction in New Jersey classrooms is that the compensation of teachers is not related closely enough to the satisfactory results, instructional results of their kids. I don't believe that. I believe that what Tom said is the best explanation for why we have frustration, and that is we don't know what to do frequently. The people who supervise teachers don't know what to do. The people who supervise the supervisors don't know what to do. The people who sign the contracts with the supervisors of the supervisors don't know what to do. The people who pass the statutes in Trenton or hand down the court decisions don't know what to do, but they all act like they do. That's the problem.
No, I know, because there are examples of people who are having success.
There are no answers to be taken off the shelf. That's what we've always looked
But
for.
how do you have 80% passage rate in Union City? What are they doing differently, and why isn't that replicated?
That is
and what's the problem?
That cannot be covered in the time that Professor Keevy has given.
That's the answer. You have to get to that.
Gordon is absolutely right, so I'm going to have to go to the right here.
I want to thank Gordon MacInnes for his comments on special education, because I think it's a topic that hasn't really gotten enough attention. Dr. Trachtenberg mentioned earlier that he felt SEPA was a step backward from SFRA, and I think the special ed community agrees. SFRA has moved away from the tiered system and away from the placement neutrality that we saw under SEPA, especially for kids with highest costs. So here's the question. Consolidation efforts, as evidenced by the role of the executive county superintendent, seems to encourage grouping kids into larger classrooms, increased reliance on special services programs, which are self-contained school buildings, with the presumption that those are going to be more efficient and produce better results. Can you comment on how funding formulas can promote greater efficiency in special education in the least restrictive environment and still produce good outcomes?
That's what I've answered for the last... David, do you want to...
Well, I think fundamentally what we want is for districts from operational efficiency. Again, that's what we're here to talk about, and oftentimes we hate to look at that separate from educational effectiveness, but if you're looking at the formula and how we incent operational effectiveness, what we want is for districts to reevaluate why are they sending kids out of district, for example? Shouldn't we try to bring more kids back into district for purposes of education? And what's the quality? Is quality the factor for determining if they go out or come back in, or are dollars going to be the real true indicator of that? And I tend to think that consolidation might actually, or I think the word is, and I think we were corrected quite well, but it's regionalization. No one's consolidated anymore. It's regionalization. Might actually help that. I'm a fan that regionalization is going to help have better special ed programs for these kids.
Well, to clarify, I didn't mean that, I'm talking about regionalizing just special ed services. You build in special ed kids in
Within a district or where?
within the county.
Special county
Special services school districts?
Right.
Or all other regional programs that are just for special ed.
Let me say a couple things that will sound kind of contradictory. First is, special education has become a bigger portion of the overall education budget continually for the last 30 years. And results in special ed have not changed much in 30 years. Special ed needs a very hard, objective look at what we're doing there and what we're trying to achieve, a dispassionate look, because we're spending increasing amounts of money and we're not getting better outcomes. We're treating children better maybe, but we're not getting better learning outcomes. So that's one thing. The second thing is, in the United States, we have a particular disposition for the last couple hundred years to group people together with common characteristics for some kind of treatment. We do it in health, we do it in education, you know, and it doesn't work very well. We could argue it has the tendency actually to magnify whatever it is the traits are of that group that in fact we don't like. We get more of it. Just take middle schools for an example, which are an educational disaster, and we need to rethink them as well. But special ed needs a really hard look, to ask what we're doing and how we can do it better. And again, I would start with how can we do it better. I'd worry about the efficiency question after I figured out how we could make it work better. Then we could figure out how we would do it at least cost.
Question here, I think.
Thank you. A comment was made earlier and attributed to Commissioner Cabrera that the DOE is perhaps overmatched by the challenges, and a recent KPMG performance audit did agree with that. My question is, are we not overburdening the Department of Education and underutilizing the abilities at the local level?
Well, I don't know if that's the way to frame it. I think what we've got is an inconsistency in what we expect of the department. It is for some people not the Department of Education, it's the Department of Regulation. And it is named that because basically what the work it has done for many years is to enact regulations and then to try and monitor and enforce them. That is inconsistent by and large with what needs to happen when the department shifts its role to trying to assist school districts deal with these pedagogical puzzles that are framed for them every single day. And in order for that to happen, you really can't have an overseer relationship. And that's in fact what you have. So I think that the department has been handed a combination of expectations which are inconsistent and would be impossible for any organization to meet all of those objectives.
Paul?
I just want to bootstrap on the last question and go back to, I guess, my constitutional framework, which is we are talking about a statewide system of education, and it's indispensable to have an effectively functioning state education department. And I was struck by Gordon's examples, because if there's any area of public education that's been under state scrutiny and regulation, it's the Abbott district. Yet we hear there are these wildly disparate spending patterns, wildly disparate achievement results, and indeed Newark popped up frequently in Gordon's statistical review. As far as I know, Newark's been under state operations since 1995. So there's something inspiring here if somebody who's in charge of Abbott implementation is recounting these dramatic disparities as if the state has no role to play, has no power to exercise, and that state operation is kind of deference to local ineptitude.
Can I help Gordon?
If I could, since that, I think you actually mentioned I was responsible for Abbott implementation, which, but actually the problem was, Paul, that the attention of the school districts was focused on implementing remedies, programs, positions, and services that had been mandated in a long list by the Supreme Court, rather than concentrating on the education of the children, particularly on making certain that young children are strong readers. The districts that did best, and therefore are spending the less money, are the districts that honored the court's mandates in a paperwork way, but maintained the focus on raising student achievement and making certain that young children were strong readers. And that disparity is very noticeable. It's not conclusive. That is, there are some high-spending districts that are turning in a pattern of good performance. But by and large, the higher spending in the district, the lower the performance. And the explanation for higher spending is implementation of the full list of Supreme Court-ordered remedies.
Tom?
Let me
We'll be back to you in a second, Paul.
Comment is in a different way. I mean, Paul, your vision of what the State Department ought to be has never been. You're asking for a State Department in New Jersey that would look like the Ministry of Education in Singapore. And I wish we had the Ministry of Education in Singapore right now, because we'd be a lot further along with Abbott if we had it, rather than what we have. But the legislature in this state has never wanted a Ministry of Education. They've never wanted an active, proactive department. And so the department has been tamed. The department, every move the department makes is countered in some way by, calls from the governor, or calls from the legislature, or calls from a mayor. It's a constant political. It's not a matter of, if it was just a technical matter of what's the best thing to do and how do we get that information to the district, it would be easy. It's not a technical matter. It's always a political matter, always.
Just something, just 1 second, Paul, just to respond. This is something actually I know a little about.
Show the scars.
What Bill, I think, was referring to was the fact that it's a deployment issue. Every time a new requirement comes in place, like the takeover legislation is a perfect example, you need to deploy to that. Then you deploy towards the Abbott implementation, so you get whole school reform experts coming in. And at the same time, you're deploying people away from licensure, for example. Now, those people go away. They leave. They're fired. And then all of a sudden, your licensure department blows up because it can't do the volume. And then you say, all right, we got to deploy people back over here. So you're constantly losing people and deploying them elsewhere. Then NCLB came in. You had to have a new assessment department online. And all of a sudden, you're deployed everywhere where you never thought you'd be deployed, and you've got no one that you can really, no basis to do anything else. And all of a sudden, the expertise level drops, people get overloaded and quit, and you just can't do it.
Right.
You just can't do it.
You got the last word, Paul.
I don't know whether this is on.
It's on.
Yes.
My only point is that Union City and West New York are as much Abbott districts as Newark and Jersey City and Patterson are. They're subject to the same court mandate. They're apparently, from Gordon's description, doing things differently and better than districts that are not succeeding. They're all Abbott districts. Indeed, if there's a distinction, it's that Newark is under state operation and Union City is not. Now, I don't know where you go with that. But, I don't think it's fair to say it's the Corcoran Abbott imposing expensive and unworkable remedies on Abbott districts, because not all the Abbott districts seem to be afflicted.
Let me have the last word.
Can't think of anyone.
I guess you could have guessed.
The Supreme Court ordered every elementary school to adopt the whole school reform model and gave presumptive favoritism to Success for All, a model which is okay in first kindergarten and first grade in terms of teaching by direct instruction certain phonetic skills. Oh. If implemented perfectly, Success for All will ensure the failure of Abbott children because it did not address in the curriculum that it mandated writing, which is 50% of the New Jersey Ask 3 and 4 test. And so you had 67 examples of schools implementing Success for All, many of them doing it just as they were ordered to do by Johns Hopkins University, and the results were pathetic. And that was carrying out a direct order of the Supreme Court, and in a way that harmed children and did not improve the situation. That's what the department was doing, was ensuring that everybody was implementing a whole school reform model.
Just to show you can't get the last word.
I've lost all control.
I'm relinquishing the mic after this. The court got Success for All
From the department.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
All right. See, when I used to be the state budget director, I used to hear this crap all the time. All right. Congratulations to our panel.